Thanks so much for coming, everyone, today. It's my pleasure to be here. So my name is Pringle. I am the ER consultant at the University of Canterbury. So oftentimes nobody knows what ER consultant means. So really it's employment relations consultant, and it just means that I'm the employment lawyer for the university. So really what we're talking about today is sort of when you've gone through that interview stage. So you've made your application for employment, you've gone through that interview stage, and then you're at the point where you get an offer of employment from a potential employer. We'll talk a little bit about sometimes some of the questions that can come up in interviews around pay, but I'll talk about that a little bit later and how you sort of navigate around some of the trickier pay questions that might come up during an interview. But really today's focus is not about interviews. I'm sure there's a whole nother course on that or resources on that from UC Careers on interviews. So today we're really talking about when we're at that offer stage, when the employer has picked you and says, I want to make you an offer. So there's a whole bunch of things under the law, what it says has to be in an employment offer. So the first one is that it needs to be in writing. So my first really piece of advice is that you shouldn't make unchangeable plans based on a verbal offer. And I know that seems really simple, but this happens all the time in New Zealand, is people get verbal offers of employment, they make changes, and then that verbal offer changes or is withdrawn, and they don't really have anything to fall back on. Contract law says that if you meet certain legal boxes, a verbal offer can be binding. But I guess my message to you is don't rely on ticking all the legal boxes with a verbal offer. Is just don't make any plans or any unchangeable decisions until you've got something in writing in front of you. So what needs to be in writing in an employment agreement? So it needs to set out the names of the parties. And again, this seems really basic, but you just need to know who the employing entity is. If it's a company or if it's a person, who it is needs to be on the agreement. There also needs to be a description of the work that you're going to perform. So it's not good enough just to give you a job title. So if they say, oh, you're going to be a receptionist, we're offering you a job of a receptionist, it actually needs to give some sort of a description, whether it's a paragraph or bullet points or just a few list of duties or key responsibilities. You just need something more than a job title. So you just need to be looking at that description of work. Make sure you understand it, obviously, and that it's what you're wanting to sign up to, really. The employment agreement also has to include the place of work. So it doesn't need to include a specific address, but usually it will say Christchurch, so it would say the city that it was in. And then importantly, it needs to say the agreed hours of work. So I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about the agreed hours of work. What are your working hours each week? And there's really some important things that you need to remember around that, because some employers aren't getting this right. And that is, there needs to be, if it's a permanent position or a fixed term position, there needs to be a set number of hours, a minimum set number of hours. So it's not okay for there to be a 0-hour contract. So it's not okay for it to say you're guaranteed 0 hours and we'll roster you on every other week as we see fit. So there needs to be some sort of minimum hours in the contract. The other thing that you need to be looking for, which is a little bit tricky around hours of work, is availability provisions. So what used to happen in the past, which is now illegal, is the employer might say to you, on Mondays I need you from 9 to 2, but if we're really busy, I need you to stay till 5, and I'll pay you from 2 to 5, but I'm not going to tell you until, say, 1 o'clock, because I might not know if we're going to be really busy or not. But I need you to make yourself available. So what that employer is saying is, I need to make you available for that 2 to 5 shift. So now what the law sees is that if employers want to do that, and have that availability and that flexibility, that's fine, but they need to pay the employee compensation and not just their hourly rate if they work. So there needs to be some sort of financial payment to you for holding that time. It's almost like on-call time, isn't it? You're sort of on call to maybe work more hours, but maybe not. So there needs to be some sort of payment, financial payment, for you holding that time. So it's quite, I know this is quite technical and legal, but it's important just to be aware of that and just to read the hours of work clause and make sure there's not sort of, you're not having to require to possibly be available on weekends and not getting any financial compensation for that, and the employer being able to tell you last minute that you're needed for work on that weekend day. So it's just something, read the hours of work clause. If you've got concerns, I'm going to give you a link, a whole bunch of helpful links to take away at the end. There's a lot of different resources here that if you read an hours of work clause and you're thinking, actually, I'm a little bit concerned about what it says. It sounds like this availability provision that I think I heard Summer talk about ages ago, then definitely get some advice on it. Kiwisaver, so let's talk about Kiwisaver. That doesn't, an employer's obligations to pay Kiwisaver contributions doesn't have to be in the employment agreement. It does need to be in the employment agreement if it's going to be included as part of a total remuneration package. So usually Kiwisaver is paid on top. So if your pay rate was $20 an hour, usually the employer contribution, if you sign up for Kiwisaver, would be 3% or whatever the employer's contribution is on top of the $20, and then your contribution would be taken out of that $20. So, but the employer does have the ability to take it out of your hourly rate. So just if you see anything about Kiwisaver in the employment agreement, have a good read of it. Is it coming out of your hourly rate or is it on top of your hourly rate? So you need to figure that out, because the problem that sometimes again does arise is that if it's coming out of your hourly rate, potentially, depending what the hourly rate is, it might take you below the minimum wage. So right now the minimum wage is $17.70. So if that Kiwisaver contribution, if the employer's contribution is coming out of your hourly rate, then potentially you're getting below that minimum wage, which is actually illegal. So again, quite a lot of legal technicalities in there, and I don't expect you guys to be able to read a clause and know fully, you know, what the situation is. But again, it's just highlighting it for you. Look at what it says about Kiwisaver. Ask the employer if it doesn't say anything, but it doesn't, by law, have to be in the agreement, in the employment agreement, unless the employer is going to take it out of your hourly rate. And the main message, I guess, for you guys is to, you know, your employer has to, by law, provide you with a pay slip, and it should show you exactly on there what is being taken out and where it's going. So you should be able to see exactly what's happening. When you're getting an offer of employment, what you want to know is if the employer is going to take that Kiwisaver contribution out of your wage, out of your hourly rate, essentially. And it must say that in the contract. If they're going to take it out, it must say it in the contract. Majority of cases, employers don't do it like that, so the contract will likely be silent and not say anything about Kiwisaver. So in which case you just need to know it's going to be on top of my wage. I don't need to worry. There shouldn't be anything extra being taken out. So what I was saying before is just around hours of work, and it sort of again links to pay, that pay rate. It's really important to understand what your hours of work are. So typically in New Zealand, hours of work are usually, for a full-time person, are usually 37.5 hours per week or 40 hours per week. But you really need to know which it is. So if your employment agreement just says full-time, you need to still know, is that 37.5 hours or is it 40? Because then if you're offered a salary of $60,000 or whatever it is, your hours of work, if you're gonna work a 40-hour week, your hourly rate is actually gonna be less than if you worked a 37.5 hour week. So again, you can work out if an employer offers you $60,000 a year, you can work out how much the hourly rate is by dividing by 52 weeks and then divide again by how many hours it is. If it's 40 hours, divide by 40 hours. Let's see, the employment agreement also has to say when and how the pay is getting paid to you. So the wages or the salary is getting paid. So typically, usually most commonly here in New Zealand, it's fortnightly, so every 2 weeks, and it's usually by direct credit to the employee's bank account. But there's no rules saying how frequent that needs to be. Other examples are monthly to the person's bank account. Sometimes it's weekly to the person's bank account. I wouldn't agree to anything more than monthly. So I just think that it's not common, very unusual. You need to be paid at least monthly. More commonly, it's every 2 weeks. So I've never actually seen a contract where somebody was paid less frequently than monthly. So there also needs to be an explanation in the employment agreement of how employment problems are resolved. So employment problems like disputes or complaints. So there is always going to be an explanation in there, and it's usually very just a plain language. This is what you do if you have a personal grievance, a formal complaint. And really my advice around that is just read that. If you ever have any issues in your employment, just read that, read what it says. It will give you a good starting point to options that you have. So there's just 2 other things that need to be included in an employment agreement, and that's that employees will get paid time and a half for working on a public holiday. So there's 11 public holidays in New Zealand. So if your employer can ask you to work on a public holiday. If they ask you to work on a public holiday, they have to pay you time and a half. So your hourly rate plus half that rate again for each hour worked. And then also the nature of employment has to be set out in the employment agreement. So whether it's a permanent position, like a continuing permanent position, or whether it's fixed term, whether it's for a certain project or a certain covering somebody's maternity leave, or it's for a specific set of funding that we have, or whether it's casual. So I could spend a whole session on talking about the differences between fixed term, permanent, and casual, but just something to be aware of. So other entitlements are obviously 4 weeks annual leave, bereavement leave, sick leave, meal and rest breaks. So if you work between 2 to 4 hours, you're entitled to a 10-minute rest break. If you work between 4 to 6 hours, you're entitled to a half-hour unpaid meal break. So again, I'll give you this sheet to take away with different links, and that will tell you can look on Employment New Zealand, and they have a whole section on meal and rest breaks if you want to find out more about that. Trial periods. So trial periods are something that you can negotiate in your employment agreement. So trial periods can only be used by employers that have 19 or less employees. So if the university, we can't use trial periods. So a trial period is a 90-day period where the employer can trial somebody for that job to see if they're suitable. So there's a whole bunch of legal boxes that you need to tick in order for the trial period to be valid. So you guys don't necessarily need to be aware of that at this stage unless things are starting to get into trouble. But again, you can use these resources to read more about trial periods. The one thing I just want to touch on from a negotiating point of view is sometimes in an employment agreement, a trial period will say that the notice for termination sometimes it says 1 day, sometimes it says 1 week. So to me, that's not fair. So you just need to be aware of that and possibly think about how can I negotiate this to match the termination provision that's already in the employment agreement. So you will likely have a different termination provision, which might say 2 weeks notice or 4 weeks notice or a month's notice. And so there is some scope to negotiate and say, look, I'm happy if there's a trial period, if there's 19 or fewer employees in the business. I'm happy if there's a trial period, but I just think that, you know, there needs to be a longer notice period. And it might be worth even saying to the employer, hey, you know, that's fine that there's a trial period. And really what I expect is that if there's issues with the way I'm doing something, that you come talk to me about it straight away, and we'll work out a way to fix it so that I know what's expected. Because getting dismissed, having your employment terminated under a trial period shouldn't be a surprise. So the way that the law works is that the employer should have had some conversations with you and said, hey, I'm not too happy about this, or you're not quite meeting my expectations, and then given you an opportunity to meet those expectations or change before that dismissal happens. So it's just almost front-footing it, trying to negotiate a longer notice period, and yeah, just saying to the employer, hey, look, I really just want you to come talk to me if there's any issues, and if I can do anything better, then come talk to me straight away about it and we'll work it out. So when you get an employment offer, you're entitled to a reasonable opportunity to take legal advice on it. So you shouldn't ever be required to sign an agreement then and there. You should at least be given 2 working days to take it away and get some advice. Typically, usually employers give around 5 working days. So just remember that. Restraints of trade, you can negotiate around those. So again, I could spend a whole hour on restraints of trade, so just be wary, get some legal advice if you see sort of restraints of trade in your agreement. Don't start any work until you've signed the agreement, and ask for a copy of the signed agreement for you to keep. So technically, a lot of what we talked about today, you can negotiate all of it, can't you?